The tanker truck came again on a clear blue Tuesday, and half the road slowed down to watch it fill the old woman's tanks. Because there is nothing a farming county finds funnier than a person spending money to store water in a wet year. Cora Vane's hauling water again, Dale Marsh said from his tractor, loud, to the man riding with him. It rained 4 inches last week. She's got barrels catching the runoff off every roof, ponds she dug herself, ditches full to the top, and now she's buying it by the truckload. Paranoid old thing. Somebody ought to check on her. He wasn't unkind about it. He was certain, which in a small county is a different thing, and sometimes worse. Cora Vane stood by her main tank in a straw hat older than the tractor and watched the truck top off 10,000 gallons. And when the road slowed to gawk, she lifted a hand to them, friendly, and went back to checking the float valve. She'd been the county's gentle joke for 15 years. She had long ago stopped minding. Somebody asked her once, at the feed stall, why on earth a woman kept filling tanks in the rain, and Cora had said it was just what she did on Tuesdays, and gone home to fill the tanks. Because what none of them laughing on that blue morning understood, what they could not understand, having never gone through the thing that taught her, was that Cora Vane was not preparing for a wet year. She had spent 15 years, patiently, in the plain sight of a county that pitied her, preparing for a year that hadn't come yet. She was 78, and she had farmed her 80 acres alone for a long while, and the county had a settled idea of her. The odd old widow up the road with her water fixation, harmless, a little touched, hoarding rain, like other old women hoard newspaper. They didn't know she'd grown up in the memory of a drought that had killed a way of life, or who had raised her, or what that woman had put into her hands. Cora had been raised half by her grandmother, Mabel, who had lived through the dry years, the real ones, the ones that turned topsoil into a black sky and drove families off the land in wagons. Mabel had watched neighbours lose everything, not because the rain never came, but because, when it did come, they let it run off and did nothing to keep it, and then it stopped, and there was nothing saved. Mabel had raised her granddaughter on one idea, pressed into her the way you press a seed into ground, said over a dipper of water drawn from the one cistern that got their family through. You don't save water for a rainy day, child. Any fool can catch water when it's falling. You save it for the day the rain stops, because it always stops, and it never warns you when. Mabel had kept a cistern and a row of barrels her whole life, and been mocked for it in the good years, and blessed for it in the bad. And when she died, she left her granddaughter almost nothing anybody else would have wanted. A hand-drawn map of where the water moved across the home place. A rainfall ledger going back to the 1930s in 3 generations of hands. And a dented tin dipper worn smooth, the same dipper the family had drunk from through the worst of it. Cora kept the dipper hung by the kitchen door. It went with her out to the tanks most mornings. She drank from it still. Cora had spent 15 years turning her grandmother's one idea into 80 acres of it. She didn't just fill barrels, though she filled hundreds. She'd built her whole farm to catch and keep water the way most farms are built to shed it. She ran the roofs of every building into storage. An inch of rain on a big barn roof is better than 1,000 gallons, and Cora let none of it hit the ground unclaimed. She dug ponds and lined the deep ones and kept them deep on purpose. Because a deep pond loses far less to the sun than a wide, shallow one. She'd cut swales on the contour across her sloping ground, shallow ditches that ran level, catching the runoff and holding it and letting it soak down slow into the soil instead of racing off to the creek, so that even her dirt became a kind of tank, charged with moisture stored underground where no heat could steal it. She kept the ledger like her grandmother, every rain recorded, every tank level, obsessive, patient, and the county drove past and laughed at a woman filling tanks in the rain. The doubter with a name was Dale Marsh, who farmed big and modern on the flat below her and thought the whole thing foolishness. Dale ran on the aquifer and the river like everyone else, a deep well, a big irrigation rig, water on demand, the modern way. He came up to her place one spring, half neighbourly and half to needle. "Cora, I'll say it plain since we're friends," Dale said, not getting down from his truck. "You've spent 15 years and I don't know how much money storing water we get for free out of the well in the sky. It's not thrift, well, folks worry about you. There's a well 30 feet down that gives all the water this valley could want. You're carrying buckets against a flood. The well comes from somewhere, Dale," Cora said. "And what comes from somewhere can stop coming. I'd rather have the water where I can see it." Dale shook his head at her, kind and certain both, and drove back down to his rig, and Cora stood by her tank and said her grandmother's line to the blue sky. "You save it for the day the rain stops." Then she checked the float valve and went on filling the tanks. The setback came the spring before everything changed, and it came at the thing she'd worked hardest on and loved most, the big lined pond, the deep one, the heart of the whole system, 40,000 gallons of stored security dug and lined by her own hire over 3 years. The liner failed. A seam let go in the night, the way they do, and Cora came out one morning to find her biggest single store of water gone into the ground, 40,000 gallons drained away, a muddy hole where her deepest reserve had been. She stood at the edge of it, 78 years old, and felt the whole 15 years wobble under her. It was a great deal of money she didn't have to spare, and it was the centerpiece of everything, and for the first time she wondered if Dale Marsh and the whole Laughing County were right, if she was just a foolish old woman who'd spent her last good years and her savings storing rain against a disaster that lived only in a dead grandmother's memory. While the well ran on, and the rain kept falling, and nobody but her worried at all. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with Mabel's ledger open and the dented dipper in her 2 hands, and her grandmother's line came back to her, turned all the way around. "You save it for the day the rain stops." But the rain hadn't stopped. It had rained all spring. The only thing that had stopped was her own pond holding water, and maybe that was the sign. Maybe she'd been storing against a drought that was never coming, while the real waste was the money and the years poured into a hole in the ground. She sat a long time. She didn't sleep. But she'd been raised by a woman who'd watched a whole country blow away for want of a little saved water. And somewhere in the night she heard Mabel under the doubt. Not scolding, but plain. "A leak's not a reason to stop saving, child. It's a reason to save better." And Cora saw it. She trusted one big store, one liner, one point of failure. Exactly the thing her grandmother warned against. The way the whole valley trusted one well. The fix wasn't to quit. It was to spread the water wider and hold it in more places, so no single failure could empty her out. She rebuilt the pond, deeper and double-lined, and then she did more than rebuild it. She added tanks, added barrels, cut more swales, put her water in a dozen forms across the whole farm so that the ground itself and the tanks and the ponds all held a share. And no one crack could ever drain her again. Then the summer came that the whole valley would name for the rest of their lives. It didn't rain in May. That happened. It didn't rain in June, and men started to watch the sky. It didn't rain in July, and the river dropped to a trickle, and then it dropped below the trickle, and the county went dry the way Mabel always said it would, not slow, but all at once, a historic drought settling over the whole region like a lid on a pot. And the well, the deep aquifer well that Dale Marsh and half the valley ran on, the water that was supposed to be endless 30 feet down, the well ran low. Because an aquifer is only rain that fell a long time ago, and when the whole valley pulled on it at once in a drought and no rain fell to recharge it, the water table dropped, and the pumps started sucking air, and the modern farms that had laughed at the old woman found out the thing she'd been trying to tell them for 15 years. What comes from somewhere can stop coming. Their crops burned. Their ponds, the wide, shallow ones nobody bothered to make deep, evaporated to cracked mud in the heat. Their irrigation rigs stood silent over dying fields. Dale Marsh watched his cattle stand at a dry tank in August and had no water to give them and nowhere to buy it. Because when a whole region goes dry at once, there is no water for sale at any price. And up the road, on 80 acres everyone had pitied, Cora Vane's farm was green. Not lush, she wasn't a magician, but alive, her deep ponds still holding under the sun she'd built them to beat. Her tanks full, her soil still damp underneath from 15 years of swales soaking the rain down into it where the heat couldn't reach. Her garden and her stock and her small fields carrying through a drought that flattened everything around her. She was the only farm still standing in the valley, and she was standing on nothing but water she'd caught for free over 15 patient years, while the county laughed and called it a fixation. They came knocking. That was the part the whole valley would remember. One by one, the neighbours who'd pitied her drove up the road they used to slow down on to gawk, and stood at her gate, hats in their hands, and asked the old woman they'd called paranoid whether she could spare any water. And Cora Vane, who had every right in the world to remember every laugh, opened her gate. She didn't gloat. There wasn't a drop of it in her. She gave water to the neighbours whose children needed it, and the neighbours whose stock was dying. Out of the stores she'd spent 15 mocked years building, and she asked for almost nothing back, because her grandmother had not raised her to sell mercy to thirsty people. Dale Marsh came last, the proudest and so the slowest, and stood at her gate in August with his cattle dying below. "Cora," he said, and couldn't quite finish. "My tank's dry, the well's giving out. I told you it was foolishness. I told the whole county you were touched." "You did," Cora said. "I've got 40 head that'll be dead by the weekend. Then bring them up the lane to the North Pond," she said. "There's water. I built it deep so the sun couldn't have it. It'll get your cattle through." And when he started, ashamed, to talk about paying her, she stopped him. "You'll do the same for somebody someday. That's how it gets paid." She let it sit, no barb in it. "I'm not going to hold the laughing against you, Dale. You couldn't see a dry year and a wet one. Most folks can't. My grandmother could, so I learnt to. That's all it ever was." Dale Marsh brought his cattle up the lane and drank them at the old woman's pond, and they lived. And he was never able to say the word paranoid again without it turning to ash in his mouth. The good spread the way water spreads, to the low places first. Cora's stores carried a half-dozen families and their animals through the worst of that summer, and when the rains finally broke the drought that fall, something in the valley had changed for good. Because they'd all seen it now, seen the well fail and the old woman's tanks hold, and by the next spring there were barrels under the neighbours' downspouts, and new ponds being dug deep, and swales cut on the contour, up and down the valley. The whole county quietly learning to do the thing they'd laughed at, taught by the woman they'd pitied. That was the summer they stopped calling it Cora's fixation, and started calling it Cora's wisdom, and the old woman found young farmers at her gate, now asking not for water, but for how to catch it, how to keep it, how to read the ledger and cut the swales, and she taught everyone who asked, because her grandmother had taught her. And knowledge like that is another kind of water. It's only worth anything if you let it move to where it's needed. She kept Mabel's things where they'd always been. The rainfall ledger stayed on the kitchen table, her own hand filling the pages now under 3 generations of others. The hand-drawn water map hung framed on the wall, and the dented tin dipper stayed by the door, the one the family had drunk from through the dry years her grandmother survived, that Cora drank from through the dry year she'd spent a lifetime getting ready for. Some mornings, out among the full tanks in the cool before the heat, she'd fill the old dipper from the pond she'd built deep enough to beat the sun, and drink and say the line the way Mabel said it to a little girl who grew up to remember. "You don't save water for a rainy day, you save it for the day the rain stops." Because it always stops, and it never warns you when the rain had stopped, the way her grandmother swore it always would, and a whole modern valley that trusted the well and mocked the barrels had learned in one killing summer what one old woman had never let herself forget, that the time to save is the time when saving looks like foolishness. And the ones who look paranoid in the good years are so often just the only ones still listening to thee. People who lived through the bad ones. If you've ever been called foolish for preparing for a day that hadn't come yet and lived to see it come, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral runs clear as water in a deep pond. The wise thing and the foolish thing often look exactly alike in the good years. You only find out which was which when the rain stops. Save when you can, not when you must. And the ones the world laughs at for keeping too much are so often the only ones with anything left to share when everyone finally comes knocking. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and about the person who taught you to prepare for the dry years while everyone else was dancing in the rain. If this story reached you, share it with someone who's quietly getting ready for a day nobody else believes is coming. And whatever you're filling your barrels against right now, in whatever wet and easy season, may you have your grandmother's memory, the patience to save through the laughter, and the deep quiet grace, when the drought finally comes, of being the one with water enough to open the gate,